I'm going live. Okay, we are live. So, hello everyone. As you can notice, I'm speaking in English because our guest today, of course, speaks English, but not only English. You can see him. Is Lev Manovich. Thank you very much for being with us today, Lev. It's a great pleasure, and I'd say it's an honor to host you. We are today here to speak about your last book, which is a very big and I'd say magnificent book called Cultural Analytics, edited by the MIT Press, which is kind of a milestone in the studies related to let's say, data science, humanities, media theory. It is inserted in a kind of a cross between all these disciplines. I see that the streaming is going on, but I just take the link for you so you can post it on your.
I know, but I'm going to your Facebook page. There is nothing.
Yeah, but
there is nothing there. I mean, I'm at this page. Okay, look just a second. I'm at this page, and there is nothing here.
Let me see.
Nothing.
Kind of a cross between all these disciplines. Okay, here you have the link. I think you have to refer.
No, but before you say, I refreshed it already. There is nothing here. I think. Nothing.
Try with the link because I think there is.
Do you see it? I don't see anything. I don't. I mean, I'm at the page, right? It's the same page.
Gabriele, can you see us?
Yes, I'm just posting the link because I'm.
Okay, so before. Okay, okay. Just a second. Let me look. I just clean my cache to make sure, So just a moment, clean my cache. Okay. Just a moment, and let's see. Okay, just a moment. Just a second before we start. We haven't started yet. Okay, it's actually 3 minutes to 10. So why you starting early? Okay, it's this. It's a different link. Okay,
yes,
okay. Here we go. Okay. Just a moment. Okay.
Can you see it?
Yeah, but very strange. When I go to a page, there is nothing.
Or maybe.
But, when I go to page, there is nothing there. When I go to full page. When I go to full page, there's nothing.
You cannot see.
No, I can't see it. So I'm also not going to post it because people can't see it. Yeah. So how can I post anything when people can't see it?
Okay.
And I'm also not. Yeah. And until I see it, I'm also not going to see anything.
I see now we have 21 spectators. They are growing.
Okay. So what is the link exactly?
I think you can use the last one in the chat. The last one, the short one.
Okay, but the short one, yeah. So I don't see it. Okay, the short one. Which one? This one?
The last one, yes.
Well, okay. Now I see it. Okay, but it's a completely different link. Okay. It's not okay. Yeah, this is a different link. Okay. This is a different link. Okay. Fine.
Okay, so I would. Yeah. Sorry.
It says there are 7 people, not 23. So, no. So but it's 7 people here.
I see 18 actually.
No, it's oscillating.
It says 7. All right, guys. Okay. 10. Okay.
Well,
give me a second. Okay, give me a second because give me a second because I will get some more people. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, just give me a second. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. This is okay. So, okay. Okay. Started. Yeah. Okay. 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 Well, just a second.
No worries.
Just a second. I'm typing. Maybe we'll get some more people. Okay. Well, just okay. Okay. Let me see if it shows up. Okay. Yeah. Now it works. Okay. Okay. Sorry.
No problem. No problem.
Wow. I can see. Oh my God! It's so cool. I can see it on my. Own Facebook page.
Okay.
Let's start. Yeah.
So, as I was saying, our objective today is, first of all, to say thanks to you, Lev, because it's a great pleasure and honor to have you as a guest in our show, but also to present your last book, which is a very huge book, both in, let's say, in the number of pages of it, but of course, because it's a kind of, it proposes your paradigm in order to do data science and media theory, and so it collects several of the projects you made, but also all the epistemological framework you personally created. So the book, as I was saying, is Cultural Analytics, edited by MIT Press. It's a book me and Gabriele already read, and we strongly advise all the people is looking and listening at us to read it, because it's very important. It's a kind of a milestone in our fields. Of course, in this particular show, we usually talks about semiotics, but and in this book there is also a kind of recurrent isotopy, which is semiotic in a certain way. So we will have the occasion to talk about it. But first of all, I give the word to my friend Gabriele to present you to our audience.
So actually, I think that Lev Manovich doesn't need any kind of presentation. I will just say that cultural analytics comes as the latest token in a series of very important books that we all have read and studied across the years. So The Language of New Media, 2001, Software Text Command, 2013, Instagram and Contemporary Image, 2017, and AI Aesthetics, 2018. I would like also to say to our audience that you can actually read cultural analytics, I think, free of charge on Amazon Kindle, because you can read it online. So it's a really easy to get to read this book. And for us as semioticians, is an important book because it directly addresses the relationship between how to analyze something when this something is culture today, contemporary culture, and so the issues that social sciences and humanities in particular are confronting with by dealing with contemporary culture and trying to analyzing it. I would like to start with a really kind of easy and journalistic question, which is, this book is so comprehensive, is so big in scope. You can find a lot of stuff, and as you say in the introduction, it's a kind of handbook for students. It's a kind of research guide for scholars. It's really clear in the style in which it is written. So it's really multitasking, purpose, I think. And you took a lot of time to come up with this book. I remember that I was working on something about so-called viral contents online at the end of 2017, and you already said on your Facebook that the book was kinda about to be published. So you've been working on this cultural analytics book for a very long time. This is why, that is because you wanted to put all the up-to-date stuff that you were working on, or you revised the style. If you can tell something about why such an important book needs to be produced in a lot of years.
Before I answer, I just want to say that on the Facebook, the image you see of me is delayed maybe 10 or 15 seconds. Like, I'm saying this now, but on the Facebook, you see me from 10 seconds ago, so I'm not talking. So it's a very strange experience.
I think there is a little delay, yes.
Yeah.
I would say 5 to 7 seconds. Anyway, okay. So this is maybe the future. Okay. So so there are two ways to answer your question. I kind of put the book together, the first draft, very quickly, in about 6 weeks, in the summer of 2016. And when I sent it to MIT Press, and we sent it to reviewers, and the reviewers said, well, it's a bit rough, so you have to revise it. And when I took 3 years to revise it, so when the book came out, so it's over 4 years. But I first got the idea for cultural analytics in November 2005, right? And then by the time I started writing the book in 2016, me and people in my lab published maybe over 35 articles and kind of blog posts. So I have lots of material. So from a first idea, right, I got to do it, and to the book, it's 15 years exactly. So I think that's actually, so I actually spent longer on this project when I spent previously on so-called theory and history of new media. Or maybe the same, because my first article about digital culture was published like in 1990. So it's also 15 years, 15 years. So,
okay.
Yeah, a long time.
So the problem in this book is that, of course, you identify a kind of global culture, global digital culture, and you ask yourself, and of course you ask also ourselves, how can we study this culture? How can we see this culture? So, for example, if we think about images and the explosion in the production of images, user-generated images and user-generated contents, how can we study them? So, and that's the question which opens the book. In the introduction, you write how to see 1 billion images. So my question is, did you find an answer? Did you find a way to see all these images?
Wonderful question. Well, I found parts of the answer, right? But not a full answer. So let me explain. So on the one hand, as I was thinking about these ideas, right, and developing my lab from 2007 onward, and we started with kind of doing various experiments with visualizing lots of sets of images, and then kind of sorting these images automatically by different properties, color, contrast, content, and so on. And we developed interactive software, which was running on a huge 8-meter display where you can load up to 10,000 images. Basically, we extended principles of interactive data visualization to visual culture, and definitely you can see a lot. But later I realized two complications. One is, so I wrote in 2010, I wrote some software, which I call ImagePlot, which kind of allows you to create these visualizations on your desktop. And the software was distributed as open source. And then people will start sending me or sharing with me visualizations we produced by themselves, or maybe we produced in some class. And maybe I shouldn't say it because it's not very polite, right? So I've seen dozens of examples, and none of these examples struck me as being really amazing. So I thought, why is it like in my hands, I'm able to create some really interesting results. Like, for example, right, like I tell you some new things about Van Gogh, or I tell you some new things about development of modern art, and why other people use it, but somehow the results don't strike me as amazing. So when I realized that, yes, the computers, the visualization tools, media tools, they give you lots of capacities to see new things, but you still have to have real background in history of art, or history of cinema, or cultural studies, or art. So when I use these tools, I also bring 50 years of background. I say 50 years because I started taking art classes at the age of 10 or 12, right? So 50 years of experience as an artist, design educator. So even though I may say, I'm just going to look at 1 million Instagram images, I don't have any idea. I'm just going to play with tools, but behind the tool, I have 50 years of experience here, right? And that's a thing. So that's one thing. The second complications which I realized, and now I'm writing with an Italian colleague a short book, which partly talks about it, is this idea that while we can compare 1, 2, 1,000, 1 million, 1 billion, 1 trillion images on many dimensions, right? Color, composition, maybe even mood, presence of people, faces, etc. When we compare images, right, in 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions, we can only do it on 2 or 3 dimensions at the same time, right? Which means this comparison only can capture a very small part of differences between these 2 images, right? Another way to put it is to think about the idea of Gestalt psychology, right? So in the 1880s, early psychologists realized that how do people hear a melody, right? You can hear individual tones, right? So there's no melody in the data, but the human brain constructs a melody. Even in the 1920s and 1930s, these principles were also found in visual perception, right? And Gestalt psychologists realized that when we see something, this Gestalt is larger than the mechanical sum of the parts. So how does this apply to cultural analytics? Basically, what we realized in the last few years is I run into exactly the same problem, which visual semiotics have run. Semiotics in general has run by the end of 70s, right? And as you know, semiotic project had lots of hope in the early 60s, and then by the late 70s was a big crisis, at least from as I see it. That you can take any image, text, literally text, a blog post, a sculpture, fashion design, right? You can take any cultural artifact or experience, you can break it into science or collections of science or into pixels, or into features, right? So in the case of semiotics, people would kind of manually break something into science. Now we have computational methods, so we can break billions of text into words, right? Into letters, into paragraphs. We can break billions of images into their parts, into the statistics of color, right? But the point is, you're basically taking something and you're breaking it into lots of elements, even you're hoping that by looking at these elements, you'll understand how the whole works. And it doesn't, right? It doesn't. Yeah. So I can take, one image, a million images or 2 images, and I can compare them. And I can say, yes, these 2 images are more similar in terms of color. These 2 images are more different in terms of composition. These 2 images are more different in terms of how the neck of the subject is drawn. But this is only some dimensions, right? So ultimately, we don't know how human brain kind of perceives, how perception, memory, cognition interact. We know in some simple cases, right? So that's why semiotics works very well when you apply it to simple things like like a light, red, green, blue, and intersection. And in the same way, cultural analytics works very well when you have certain simple cases, right? So when we can visualize the evolution of design in the 4,500 covers of a Time magazine, we see a very particular trend, right? Illustrations become photographs. First we show people, then we show compositions. So that's true. But if you want to go beyond that, right? Especially if you're dealing with good art or good design, and you want to start thinking about subtle differences, the approach begins to have problem, right? So, so on the one hand, I'm very, very proud, of what we've done, and of course, right, there are now tens of thousands of researchers, right? I mean, hundreds of thousands of researchers who in the last even 5 years published papers which analyze culture using computational methods, right? People do amazing papers when we analyze fashion, architecture, etc. Yes, we were the first to start applying it to visual culture, but very soon other people joined. So there is great, there is great success. But for me personally, the more time I spend on this, I also realized that I'm running into exactly the same problem, which from my point of view, semiotics and also structuralism have run by 1970s, when people realized, that yes, you can separate certain signs, right? And you can talk about how a work kind of communicates with science, how something is constructed, whether it is Balzac novel or advertisement, right, for pasta, which Roland Barthes analyzed. And in certain images, which maybe have a very, very clear message, this works. But art is about ambiguity, right? Art is about multiple interpretations. As Umberto Eco pointed out in 1962, right? It's open work, right? We read it completes a work. And the reason humans have art is that we don't know how it works, right? There's a mystery. And that's why, whether it is semiotics or psychoanalysis or cultural analytics or cultural studies, any cognitive approach can be very revealing, but there's going to be kind of content or there's going to be dimensions, right, of culture where it has nothing to say to us. So I don't know, is it a success? Yes and no.
Gabriele?
Yes, we already...
Sorry for my long answer, but I'll try to make it shorter. Yeah.
No. We want you to make long answers, actually. Yeah. We already raised a lot of topics and issues that the book develops a lot and that are fundamental to humanities in general and semiotic research in particular. So culture as a whole, the evolution of culture, how culture changed and multiplied itself, and we have to deal with so much stuff that culture is today and which is global and shared. The idea that we cannot get rid of what we have done and studied before, but that at the same time we have to blend theoretical approaches and methodologies. So we have a lot of stuff to talk about, but I think that it is interesting that you almost has been chasing this approach all across your career, because you started studying how, we can call it maybe algorithmic culture, worked at the beginning, and then you started applying algorithmic culture so as to study culture itself. So from the language of the new media, software takes command, and now we are applying the evolution of what we had studied before. Something that I really want you to talk like in a jam session all the time you want about is the relationship, which I think it's core to semiotics, between, and you already raised this issue, the relationship, which is a problem, for example, for classical statistics approach, between norm and we can call it exception. So today we cannot just consider the big statistic stuff that works according to mathematical methodology. So the norm, something which is recurring and which is really easy to be studied with our categories.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, we do not have to get rid of the noise. You call it noise because statistics call it noise, and we have to
noise, which is something like a formula model doesn't explain. Variability.
Yes. For example, the history of art, the history of aesthetics, as you say in the book, really focused on exceptions, because the avant-garde is not a very common way of doing art. So we have to deal with this dichotomy, with these two elements that make actually culture. We have the norm, we have a lot of boring stuff, and you quote Franco Moretti, for example. The history of culture, the history of literature would be really boring if we study not the avant-garde, but we have to take them into a whole. And maybe cultural analytics is a good way to conceive this idea of culture.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I will try to make a few comments, but not as long.
Okay.
So one of the motivations behind what I call cultural analytics, because there's also other versions which are fine, is to make the study of culture more democratic, right? To include more people, more voices. So if you want to make a history of 20th century art, I want to include every artist who worked in 20th century, even if a person never had art exhibitions, right? So if I want to study visual culture, sorry, I have a problem with chair. If I have, yeah, it's okay. Sorry. If I want to study kind of visual culture today, no, I don't want to start with like what's shown at MoMA or what's shown in the Pace Gallery. No, I want to ideally collect every image being created today and compare them. And computationally, it's possible to some degree. It's actually possible, right? So if Facebook can process, billions of comments and billions of posts every day, we can also do it, and we don't need as much equipment. The reason Facebook and Google and Amazon need to have this huge server farm is they do it in real time. But if you say we don't need to do it in real time, we can do it with like delay, like a year, right? You can do it in your PC. So in a sense, right, I very much follow Moretti, but I kind of want to look at the culture in terms of everything. And the result may be very boring, but it also depends on which period, right? I think if we look at 15th or 16th century, everything is not boring. If we look at 19th century, maybe it's not boring, and maybe what we think boring is more interesting when impressionists, as we actually don't know. And then, of course, I would like to find some clusters, right? Some groupings, some categorizations. And then I want to understand what are the things which we think is exceptional, right? Because I think if you statistically approach any cultural period, right, whether it is Instagram today or 19th century painting or whatever, you'll find lots of outliers, right? You'll find lots of things which are strange. But among the strange things will be something like Picasso, and will be some things which are completely boring, right? And I'm not sure a computer will be able to understand. But in general, I start with assumption that the way we practice cultural history, cultural theory, and so on, comes from 19th century. 19th century was trying to categorize things and kind of put things in categories, right? It's also creation of nation states. So people talk about Italian art and French art, right? Yeah. So it's basically about these categorizations. And in a way, we inherited this, right? I mean, we're talking about history of artists in terms of periods, right? So Van Gogh lived in art when he lived in somewhere else, etc. Meanwhile, the science, at least since Descartes, right, and Newton, since the 17th century, has been using mathematics and visualization in order to avoid categorization and in order to represent nature in terms of changing variables, right? Temperature, pressure, speed, and so on. So it's about time, it's kind of logical, right, that the humanities have also adopted these tools. This doesn't mean that they have to completely get rid of categories. Categories are very important, but categories shouldn't be the only way in which we look at culture, right? So in a way, there are two ideas here. One is, right, we have to scale up. We have to make our study of culture and also our cultural practice, right, more inclusive. I mean, what about millions of cultural producers today who don't live in New York or don't live in Milan, right? Or what about tens of thousands of small museums or small cultural centers? They will never make it into any cultural history, right? So how do we make them visible? How do we give them a voice? How do we help them to create regional context? And then historically, once we expanded our field and included, for example, every painting and every provincial museum, so how do we write the history of 20th century art, which consists of 1 million paintings as opposed to 1,000 paintings? And then we can say we can categorize it, we can look at clusters, we can look at continuities, we can look at connections. So in a way, it's a project which is about democratization of culture, and in a way, paradoxically, to really democratize, to make our understanding of culture more inclusive, we actually have to use scientific tools. Right? And maybe it makes sense because when scientists, right, look at nature, well, there is no class, there is no categories, right? I mean, there is atoms, right? There is molecules, there is stars, right? So you don't have this issue of power, right? Power is something humans create and impose on other humans.
So, Lev, my impression while reading your book was that the book at the same time provided both a new theoretical paradigm, but also a way to transform computational cultural analytics in a result not only useful for the scientific audience, so papers and so on and so forth, but also through data visualization for people all around the world. And this is, for me, it's quite interesting because I work on visual culture too. And my question is, do you think that data visualization is only a kind of intersemiotic translation of an ensemble of data? So another way to represent them, or, as I think, do you think that it can add something more to this ensemble? I ask this also because...
I understand, yeah. Well, I mean, I think, so I think like if you look at the definitions, right, of data visualization, right, across hundreds of textbooks, right?
Yeah.
The definition which comes, so for designers, it's like another design techniques, right? But for people who actually who develop techniques like computer scientists, the basic idea is data visualization or information visualization. It's a method to find insights of data, right? So it's a method to find insights of data, which you can't do any other way, right? So how does anybody today, whether in business, in science, in government, in medicine, how do you start looking at data? I mean, start visualizing it to get the sense of what's inside, right? So this idea that it's simply translation is, I think, it doesn't make sense to me, right?
Okay.
But then what the problem is that the visualization methods which develop, right, since the approximately 18th century, how do you extend them so we can also explore data sets which have not just numbers and not just letters, but data sets of images, videos, interactives, and so on. So that's kind of what we try to do in our lab. And the last part of the book talks about these methods. Methods are incredibly simple. I mean, today you can use computer vision and deep networks and so on and make much more complex analysis. But I was surprised how far I was able to get in the lab using this very simple method. And when I talk about these methods, they're both like practical methods, but they're also in very theoretical categories, right? Mm-hmm. So you take the idea of comparison, which is, in a way, humanities only have one method, which is comparison, right?
Yes.
So the modern art history starts in 1900, when Wolfram starts using two magic lantern projectors to compare two images. Okay, so comparison. So how do you compare across billions of artifacts, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So that's why. So the last part of the book is really about both using very simple methods to analyze visual data sets, but it's also about more theoretically how do these cognitive and visual operations allow us to kind of think culture differently, better, see new things.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most relevant theoretical points of your book, which is at the same time really strongly practical, because it suggests a methodology and it provides lots of examples in order to understand it, and also advices to try it, because I really appreciated the part in which you say you can do classes with this book, and you suggest to use the book as a kind of, let's say, work in progress, starting point in order to
kind of workbook, right? I mean, I myself started kind of teaching some of these methods practically in 2006. So I've been teaching it for 14 years. I also done dozens of workshops. I mean, other people do it. But, today, of course, it's much bigger, right? So today there are tens of thousands of people who work in digital humanities in other countries, including Italy, right? So, but people who do digital humanities, it's still mostly text analysis, right? Some people do maps, but very, very few people work with images. It just barely got started. So one of the goals of my work, right, for, let's say, 2005 to 2016 was to kind of motivate people to start looking at images. And I think now there's more projects in this thing called digital art history, but it only started around 2017, right? So it only started very recently. So I'm waiting, of course, as every author, to see reviews of his book. I know from MIT Press that maybe about 20 publications ask for a copy of a book to write review, but it's very slow, it's academic. But just yesterday I got sent first review by the press. It's a very short review because it comes out in a very special publication called Choice, which is publication of university libraries. And it's not a normal magazine. It consists of like one paragraph reviews of many books. And it didn't come out yet, it'll be published in March issue. But MIT Press already has it, so I was like, oh. It's very short. It says the book is about this. It has become recommended in undergraduate and graduate classes. And it will go well with another book, which is Pierre Bourdieu Distinction. Well, this is the biggest compliment I can get, right? Because Distinction, in a way, it's also, right, a kind of practical book, right? As you know, sociology of culture never recovered from Distinction, right? So from 1979, it was published in English, it's still referred to this idea that we can look at culture in terms of kind of latent manifestations of kind of classes and symbolic capital. Well, in the way, it's also practical. You don't use computer, but it's practical in a way it gives you a particular lens of culture, right? And of course, there's lots of other lenses. So I just want to give you other lenses. And my idea is to, again, not to start with categories, like Bourdieu starts with categories, right? Class, education, even he says symbolic capital, which is great. But in a way, it's extension of 19th century kind of, right? Sociology, Marx, two classes, and so on. And then in the last, I think, few years ago, there was a very big research in Britain by sociologists. They had hundreds of thousands of people doing questionnaires, and they said, okay, there's 13 classes in Britain, right? But there's still 13. And my idea, well, maybe we kind of do what the artists do, right? When artists paint, artists, or cinematographers, right? We don't just think with ideology messages. We work with light and color and so on. So let's start working with images themselves and see what kind of groupings, what clusters we could find. So in a way, it's kind of more, let's say, bottom-up approach, right?
Yes.
So maybe perhaps if Bourdieu is like a modern age Marx, perhaps I'm a modern age, I don't know, late 19th century physicist or chemist who starts with atoms.
You were always you were and are always compared to other important scholars in the field of cultural studies in general, media theory. For example, The Language of the New Media obviously was compared to the new reference book for the field after McLuhan. Now you are being compared with Bourdieu, that you already talk about a lot in the book yourself, because it's a kind of reference point of methodology in social sciences in that era, and now we are trying to do something different as regards the methodology, but the sense of trying to understand and not to explain culture is very similar. But I wanted to something that it's really clear when you read the book, which is written in first person, obviously. It's you writing, so it's a matter of style, which is different from a lot of things that we used to read, for example, in academic or scholarly publishing. It's your story. It's the story of the Cultural Analytics Lab from...
Absolutely, yeah. And I want to say just very quickly. So when I gave MIT Press manuscript, and after a few months, I got all these reviews. And you know what we said? He has to revise. I mean, he has to take the story out. It's irrelevant. I said, no, I want to leave it because the story itself is a kind of part of a theory. We search for ways in which computers can be used as new tools on culture. Sorry, guys. So for me, it's important. I think it also makes it more interesting. Please go ahead.
Definitely. I think that this is a subtle stylistic device in the writing that helps, that enhance the understanding of the theory, because you talk in first person, you talk about your direct experience, so you are not talking about cultural analytics in general, and you say that really clearly. This is my view on this paradigm. I propose my experience, and so you always talk me and my group of researchers, me and my lab, which is something that is uncommon, and it's
I see. So basically saying I'm not trying to present some kind of encyclopedic objective, like this is film studies, so with semiotics. Yeah. It's so interesting because I haven't thought about it at all. and it's interesting that you point this out. I mean, I did it for very particular reasons, but to me it's very interesting that you see a different way. The reason I've done it, right? So in 2016, I mean, some colleagues of mine, not me, started Journal of Cultural Analytics, so it's one representation. And then when I was finishing a book in 2019, I found about 12 or 14 courses in cultural analytics, and I realized everyone means something else. So I basically said, I don't want to speak for hours, right? I kind of want to give you my version. So in my case, it was very pragmatic, but you're saying maybe it was not just pragmatic, but maybe it was a kind of rhetorical and poetic, and somehow it has a different meaning. Well, it's interesting.
I think that it's pretty clear that an effort so as to build up this new way of seeing culture as big data, okay, is an effort that the outcome should be, as you already mentioned it, democratic, inclusive. We have to try to understand the culture as a whole, not only the avant-garde, not only the big cities. Okay, this is pretty clear.
Right,
and in the way, in the process, you are doing a work, a research work, which cannot be nothing but a collective group work, because you are using different expertises, different people with different backgrounds. You have a background in aesthetics and in psychology and in cultural studies, but you are using people who are engineers, who are informatics people. So I think that it's really methodologically fundamental to understand that an effort such as the one of working in the paradigm of cultural analytics has to be a research team, a group work. So you have to put together a lot of experiences, a lot of expertises, a lot of backgrounds in order to take a project from the idea, for example, of analyzing 1 billion images to the fact that you actually can gather the data, can represent it, can analyze it. So it's pretty clear to me that if I myself wanted to do cultural analytics, I had to build up a project which is collective and including a group of people working together on some key point issues. This is my understanding.
Yeah. Well, I think that's also a very good point. Of course, again, I'm not original in this point, right? So digital humanities started to develop. Now this field spent lots of energy on standards, on software for collaboration. We have project, right, like Europeana, which is all about it, right? So I think digital humanities in general kind of brings this idea of collaboration. The problem is that, there's a kind of heavy collaboration, light collaboration, right? So what I mean is that, European Union, they put millions of dollars into a project like Europeana. Europeana works with hundreds of thousands of cultural institutions, museums. We kind of create this virtual museum without walls, right, et cetera, and that's great. And there are thousands of people in Europe and America, Asia now, who are getting big grants to build some tools for collaboration or to work on metadata. That's great. But my idea of collaboration, me and one other person, we see something on Friday and Monday we have a project, right? So I kind of stayed away from metadata, from servers, right? I kind of, in a way, it's more like, right, people get together and do something, right, in the weekend. So in a way, it's a very terrorist approach, or like artist approach. So it's also a very non-academic approach. Before, there is a very interesting question on Facebook, which I want to talk about in a second. But I also want to say one thing, right? I want to highlight once again a deep connection between semiotics, imagination, and what I was trying to do. Because not everybody but not everybody knows that I had a very particular path. But basically, I'm a semiotician in hiding, right? So when I was 17 years old, I came across great works of Yuri Lotman, right, a famous Russian semiotician, which changed my life, right? Because at this point, I was already trying to figure out how to understand my own kind of art practice. I was studying art for a number of years, doing painting. And that's a book which in a way is responsible for me becoming a cultural theorist. How does cultural artifacts structured, how they work, how to understand them. And I think, I can talk a lot about particular connection between cultural semiotics and analytics, but I will just mention one. one lesson from semiotics, right, especially Saussurean semiotics, is that meaning, it's about connections, right? Meaning can never be found inside one sign, inside an object. It's about interactions, right, and positions of signs, right? So Saussure kind of develops this idea in relation to phonetics, right? So all the kind of sounds in a particular language are defined in the positions to each other, right? So that's basically a big lesson of Saussure. And then people try in the 60s expand it to larger units, right? Food, fashion, etc., etc. Well, I don't want to say that the meaning or the aesthetics or the impact of every single image on Instagram is derived from billions of other images, but when you analyze it computationally, that's what you do, right?
Yes.
So basically I say, okay, like I'm going to download whatever 100 billion images, and I'm going to analyze them, visualize them, and then I'll see what the outliers, right? And I'm going to see also what are the common elements, what are less common elements, right? So if I want to figure out if something is original, if something is typical, if something is repeating, it's all a simulation, right? And I think what is behind, kind of what the larger project behind my desire, which is a bit totalizing and it's clear to some people, is to make this data set as big as possible, right? To basically include everything, every image, every representation that human beings ever created since 45,000 years ago. And you can say, well, maybe it's not so different from film studies or art history, we're also relational, but typically we compare things within a particular period, in a particular country. Only in the last 15 years, museums started to make exhibitions where instead of going to museum and seeing things organized by country or by period, you have categories like face or landscape.
Yes.
It's a very recent development, right? It's kind of post-internet development. So that's one thing. But now I want to talk a bit about the your mind. So there's a question from Viria.
Yeah.
From cultural data analytics, quantity is quality. Well, that's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
You know, I would say like this: quantity is the new quality. Quantity is the new quality. But I think when people kind of talk about this, trying to think about, because of course he could have meant lots of different things, but maybe what he means is this, right? So in my own work, using these methods, right, I try not to talk about, I basically don't talk about quality of particular artifacts I'm analyzing, right? This is good, this is great, this is important, but not important, right? So in a way, I'm trying to, get rid of this perspective, which I think some people find very annoying. And I also agree it's a partial perspective, right? And ultimately, as I said myself, what I realized in the last few years is I think what separates good cultural artifacts from great ones, it's good ones you can compute and great ones you can't, right? Because there are small details, small differences, small things which matter, and you can say that a great work doesn't simply consist from elements, from cliches, from kind of semiotic structures which we can find somewhere else, right? It brings something else to the table. It's original. And that's also very interesting because within a kind of computational analysis of aesthetics, and people have defined mathematically terms like originality, uniqueness, memorability. So you can mathematically say, from statistical point of view, this is the image which is most original. Maybe you remember already many, many years ago that Flickr was the first platform which started to surface images which were algorithms were called original. So there are ways to actually quantify, in a way, originality and importance and so on and so forth. So that's it's not something I've been doing, but computation also I think brings some interesting aspects to that. But the last thing I want to say is that we know very well, right, that what's important changes historically. In 1900, some 18th century kind of plate from somebody's estate was more expensive than Rembrandt painting. Yeah? The contemporary canon is the result of late 19th century, 20th century, right? Today, the paintings of 20, 30 contemporary artists cost more and Rembrandt and Raphael, and that's very new development, right? So it changes over time, right? Before we thought Middle Ages is dark, now we think Middle Ages is a kind of second Renaissance, right? So I think the cultural analytics has to take this into account. The study of changing historical perception is not something I have done, but definitely I'm aware of it. And this idea that we can look at everything as a kind of one giant database and suspect the judgments of value, of taste, of beauty. There is something very crazy about this idea, but there's also something very perhaps interesting about this idea, right? Precisely because it's kind of counterintuitive, right? So I mean, I think okay. What's another question, right?
Well, just to add something to your answer and to say to Viria, the question between quantitative and qualitative analysis is one of the core questions all around the book, because Manovich tries, and I think he proposes a good solution to solve one of the most powerful stigmas on quantitative analysis, the idea that quantitative analysis cannot be also qualitative. And also, just in the not only in the first pages, but in all the book, there is the question of style, for example. How to integrate style in a quantitative analysis? How can we transform a quantitative analysis in a quantitative analysis? And I think this is one of the main problems, which is connected with all the things we are talking about, because Gabriele already told something about the relationship between norm and exception. And of course, Lev talked about Saussurean semiotics, which is a semiotics which talks about connections, but also about differences. So how can we deal with differences which are responsible for the meaning, for the creation of the meaning? So I think that if you're interested in the question of how can we do quantitative analysis, and in the meanwhile, and at the same time, integrate it with qualitative analysis, again, cultural analytics is probably the starting point to answer this question. But I see also we have other questions, because, for example, Gianmarco, if you want to read it, Lev, you can.
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah, so the question is about how do you apply computational analysis to culture, for example, to things like video games.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so when we started our lab in 2007, one of the first things we've done is to work on video games. If you go to our lab project list, you'll find some projects which we did visualizing video games from 2008, 9, 10. I haven't been showing this project in my lectures recently, but we have done one. Partly because we were driven by a PhD student I had in the postdoc who was really into the game studies. In fact, I had a PhD student who did his kind of PhD in video games, and he was already a kind of well-known person in game studies. And now he's a professor in the top European game studies program in Ireland. So the projects were driven by kind of student interests. And I will just mention one thing why computational approaches are very relevant. First of all, the cultural analytics is not just something I do. It's how media works today, right? Amazon, cultural analytics. Google, cultural analytics. YouTube, cultural analytics, right? Music recommendations, cultural analytics. Video game, right? Designers, right? Millions of people play with games. Every joystick, right? Every press goes back to the server. So we analyze all the analytics, how people play their games, and when we change the games, right? When we develop a game, we would have dozens of people playing a game, and then we visualize how people play the game, and if we see that particular place in the game is too hard, people keep like dying there, we will change it, right? So cultural analytics is a logic of modern media. Right? So in a way, all I'm doing is saying we have to acknowledge it, and we have to perhaps use some parallel methods as cultural analysts. Right? I think that's very different from digital humanities people who sometimes pretend, okay, we're using all methods, what industry does is awful. No, what industry does is what industry does, right? It's how things work, and we're still intuition, we're still creativity, but the analytics is a kind of foundation of all digital culture because it's so easy to collect data on who is viewing what, who is clicking on what, and so on, right? So in a way, you can say well, cultural analytics is an attempt to take what I say they call media analytics, which is how media works today, and actually take these tools out of them, and so we can use it ourselves to ask different questions, right? So how does it apply to video games? For example, how would you use video? How do you do video games for cultural analytics differently? So think about people playing a video game, right? If you have this open world video game, right? We have this open world, right? And sometimes the world is generated by computers, so it's actually endless. And when you have a three-dimensional character, right, who goes around, because every time every person plays a game, potentially it's a unique game. So if you want to even describe what's one game, it's potentially endless trajectories, endless sequences, and so on. Yeah? If you just play a game yourself and you write about it, that's very subjective, right? You can say everybody is seeing the same movie, more or less, right? But how can a theorist write about video game when you can experience this game in trillion different ways? Yeah? So I would say a logical approach is to use cultural analytics and to kind of map, visualize, analyze the space of these trillion trajectories. And when think about a game is not one text, but is this kind of right? Is this space of different texts which can be actualized when people play them, right? So that's so you can see how this is not about counting. This is really about very fundamental questions: what digital media, what's a work, an open work, right? So it's open work, but in a different sense when Eco wrote about it, because Eco was talking about 1962, right? There's a novel, there's a short story, and everybody reads it and makes their own version. But here, you actually, in addition to it, you're actually making a different story out of a kind of software given to you, right? So yeah, so we work on this. We did some prototypes, but I never, I've never made it a big project. So that's one example, right?
I think that we may talk for 20 hours about all this stuff because we are touching all the key points in humanities and in research actually in general. I think my main understanding of this gathering of methodologies and practical approaches, because I want to leave the room to the questions that you can pick freely as you want, Lev, but I just want to do this final remark of mine. I think that cultural analytics is really interesting as a mechanism of thinking about research, because you say that we have to take into account the fact that we have new methodologies and that we can question our categories as human scholars, as humanist scholars, thanks to these methodologies. But at the very same time, we question those methodologies thanks to the fact that we have a perspective that comes from humanities. So we are working between these two extremes, these two poles, and they are as much, one is important as much the other. So we have to be critical to methodologies, and thanks to methodologies, we can be critical to our traditional way of thinking. And it's the issue of the categories that crosses all the book from the very beginning to the end. So it's really a semiotic, thought-provoking book in this perspective, because it says, okay, we can start from these, but maybe today we have to change our perspective according to how culture has changed and our possible understanding of it has changed.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I want to say one more thing, which is I forgot, very important.
Definitely.
So basically, I said my whole kind of creative professional life is my dialogue with semiotics. So trying to figure out how we can do it better and if computers can help. So let me say it this way, right? So the great insight of cultural semiotics in the 1960s, and that's why semiotics, right? Like maybe we don't have millions of semiotics programs, but semiotics is taught in millions of classes, right? Today, millions of classes take some class in cinema studies, cultural studies, art history. The first book will be Roland Barthes, right? So semiotics really became like our kind of alphabet, right? So the great insight of semiotics was that, we should look at the cultural texts, right? A cultural performance as a kind of set of science, and how the science interact and how we refer to our science. And so in a way, you can say cultural semiotics, it's a great methodology for dealing with a discrete part of culture. Okay? So we look at the image, we say, okay, this represents this represents that, this means that. And from the beginning, Roland Barthes was struggling, right, with problem. Because he said, okay, this advertisement for Panzoni pasta, it represents the image of Italy, Italicity, but is it all limited to particular science? It seems to be distributed throughout the image, but he couldn't put his finger on it, right? And that remains a problem. So we can say that what cultural analytics does, it says, you know what, guys, this is great. But maybe we can use computers to talk about what, in a way, semiotics can do, which is talk about continuities, right? Gradients, intensity, right? Differences not of categories, but differences of degree, right? So the way to expect is not about quantity versus quality, it's categories versus quantity, right? So I think of cultural analytics in that respect as additional tool, right? As a kind of additional app you can put in your brain computer to help you analyze, which I think is fundamental to culture, which is quantitative differences, right? Differentiations, speed of change, right, etc. So, for example, right, I mean, let's say I want to look at painting X. So semiotics can talk about science, but there's also, gradual changes, right? Gradients in the background, etc., right? Maybe there's a kind of very gradual change of cinematography, in the film, right? And so cultural analytics, I think, helps us to talk about culture as a mechanism of creating aesthetics through changes in continuous variables. I mean, maybe it's a very banal, very kind of idiotic understanding of semiotics, but maybe our audience probably I don't think most of our audience have that understanding. So I'm sure, I hope people from Bologna are not here because they'll kill me for what I just said, but I think it's also better than nothing, right? Yeah, because as you know, semiotics, like when I came to America and I wanted to study semiotics, it was like the 80s and things were already starting to get ideological, and very political, not like now. So semiotics never happened. And I went to a PhD program and it was already very political, where, we spent like a class talking about Eisenstein. Instead of analyzing his great theories, the whole class was spent talking about like one line in his essay where he used the word Negro, which is what people used in 1925, right? So things were already getting difficult. And I said, okay, I kind of have to hide my semiotic interests, right? Then I waited. So maybe now it's time to bring semiotics kind of back. I mean, bring semiotics, semiotic congresses and journals, but also bring it back a bit more into mainstream, right? So maybe we should bring to a kind of semiotic revolution, semiotic takeover, with cultural studies leaving White House and semiotics entering in and started to fix what cultural studies and linguistical approach inside the reading the text, the damage done, which is try to reduce art and culture to cognitive, ideological, basically reducing it to keywords. Right? It's time, it's time for revolution. Let's storm White House and cultural studies.
It's time for a revolution. Thank you. So, if you have time, I see other questions. Sylvia asked something about Google Arts and Culture, which allows virtual visits to many museums. What's your opinion about this kind of new way to experience art?
Yeah. So in the book, I talk about this, and actually I say that there are now thousands of virtual museums and virtual libraries, right? There are new ones, and of course I can't see them all, but I've been kind of following their development since late 2000. And actually, I think that Google Arts and Culture is the best because the interface is very simple and it works, right? Because I think what's really crucial in this project is the interface has to be just right. And you only kind of it takes great designers, great programmers, great psychologists to have a great interface. And I like it, even though of course you can find biases. It doesn't cover everything. So in general, I'm all for it. But at the same time, we love going to physical museums, right? So I can't wait to go back. It's just nice to be in the museum. Nice to be in the space of artworks. But not everybody can go to a museum, right? So of course, if we want to democratize culture, in all the possible ways, the kind of virtual access to museum collections, libraries, archives, and so on is absolutely important. With the question I see very interesting about something about time span of texts derived from algorithm in the content we change quickly. Yes. Not sure I understand this answer. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but maybe I can talk about my version of the question, which is maybe a bit different, but it does talk about change.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the question of change is absolutely fundamental, right? Nobody, as far as I know, ever has tried to measure the speed of cultural change. Using many examples. Surprise, right? It's how little we know about culture, right? So we have this illusion that in 21st century, things are changing faster. Maybe things, but I think things were changing faster between 1909 and 1928. Maybe things were changing faster between 1490 and 1510 in Rome and Milan, right? Nobody measured this, so we have no idea. I mean, but definitely there are some dimensions where things do seem to change a lot. Like, for example, the way people can go to a particular social media platform, when this platform is taken over by advertising, when people move to a different platform. Or, for example, Instagram emerges in 2010 as this raw medium, right? Instagram, and then 5 years later becomes very polished, and now the raw medium is a TikTok. And I think also if you look at fashion, right? The speed of recycling, the speed of referencing, the speed of semiotics in fashion, it also seems to be increasing, right? Again, since nobody has ever measured the speed of cultural change, right? It's like we actually don't know, right? It would be very interesting, and maybe meaning people maybe talk about it in relation to particular things like speed of printing, but nobody has done it as a theoretical problem, right? But I think one thing is, I just want to say one thing, right? I think what's interesting, right, is that in the age of digital media, interactive media, network media, we're dealing with this kind of live, constantly changing ocean of content, interactions, comments, right? So you post something, somebody adds a comment, by the time somebody else sees it, there's another comment, or the link is dead, right? So you can say that there is not objectively a single artifact which keeps changing very quickly, because everybody is seeing different versions of this artifact. And you can say potentially everybody changes this artifact, right? Every time you click on a search result, it affects in some tiny way Google algorithm, because it's like a signal for Google algorithm. And this question of changeability is amazing. What's interesting is digital humanities completely avoided this problem. And even computational social science avoids this problem, right? We all deal with static data sets. So the only part of society which deals with changeability is the industry itself, right? So, Google, Amazon, Instagram, etc. We kind of build these massive technologies to basically handle the changeability, right? To be able to kind of, when somebody clicks on something, right, potentially everybody can see it like in a second, but this is technical thing, right? So, but I don't know, maybe if you look at kind of how it works technically, you can extract some theoretical categories. But I think humanities, kind of completely ignored this new changeable feature of culture, besides some very idiotic common statements. Oh, we live in billion of images, we surround a billion. Yeah, okay, tell me something more specific, right? It's like, imagine, so look, I have PhD in astronomy. I said, what do you know? I said, well, we have millions of stars. Right? So we can say that on that level, we have no idea how to talk about culture, right? We can't even calculate changeability, etc. So I think it's another very interesting challenge. And again, you can say that since this changeability is enabled by computation, right? It's the computational servers, the software, the millions of processors, right? Which allow this giant universe to exist. Probably the only way to study it is using kind of parallel computational tools, right?
Gabriele?
I just want to say something which is pretty obvious when you listen Lev talk, which is the fact that he's definitely so much passionate about what he does that he could that is really looking for always about dialogical interaction with other people doing similar and different stuff. And it was always, for example, what happened with us, because we just wrote an email to Lev and explained our format and the fact that we as semioticians are interested in his perspective, and we can learn a lot, and maybe we can exchange ideas. So Lev is like actually, as you see him on Facebook, he's always putting out stuff and commenting on with people.
This idea of connections is clearly also in his way to present himself. So in order to understand his theory, you have to understand the way he explains himself. This idea of connecting disciplines and connecting voices, and I think it's still revolutionary, this idea. So thank you, Lev.
Not because
I maybe don't spend enough time looking at following like major academics, because somehow I think if you look at the sciences, it's very typical, right? The science is very interactive, the science is very inclusive, like the papers published immediately, right? I mean, I now I work as a part of a data science lab in Korea, right? Everything done collectively. So for scientists, we always like, right? People reviewing each other papers. We're good. It's like this global ocean, right, of project. But maybe humanities or science are very different. I don't know. Maybe I just don't look at people. So maybe I didn't know I was exception, if you say so. But I want to say one thing. You know what I would love to do? I would love to spend the rest of my life writing nothing. Every day I wake up, have coffee, and I spend a whole day on Facebook reading really interesting posts and commenting. Because I think every author would like to have a nice comment. So, and as I write these comments, probably once a month I can collect them and publish as an article. In a way, it's kind of what I do, except sometimes it's kind of what I do, but not so formally. So for me personally, I can basically spend 24 hours a day talking, and then I can sit down in 10 minutes and write an article, So I don't write article by going to the office, closing the door, and sitting in front of a computer, right? And the reason I was able to write the language of new media, because I was very much in the middle of the media art community. And the reason I was able to work on cultural analytics is I was very lucky to be invited to have a lab inside like a major, future computer science research institute, where I was introduced to scientists, et cetera, et cetera. So, I kind of see myself as not Lev, but in a way I'm somebody who just spends a bit of energy to kind of give a voice to ideas, developments, phenomena, which are already happening. And I kind of, in a way, like I have to be everywhere and anywhere, right? Like in a way, like I'm like a bit of like cyber, neuromant, right? Like I kind of, disappear into the internet, and I would love to listen to every conversation, read every article, and when I kind of just basically like, connect the dots. But I also try to anticipate, right? So I'd like to see things which are emerging, and say I think this will become really important in 5 years. And before we go, I would like to spend two minutes and tell you about my new project, if you don't mind, right?
Actually, I wanted to ask you about this forthcoming book you already mentioned on Facebook, and now at the beginning of our talk. If you can say a few words, what
Sure.
about?
Well, I mean, I'm actually working on and off on about maybe 5 or 6 small books, but small one. So this book is small. We're trying to keep it to 25,000 words so people can read it, but we'll see. Trying. I'm writing it with a dear friend. He's an Italian philosopher of art. He also has background in cognitive psychology, and he's a professor in the Academy of Design, Architecture, Art, Venice. Lives in Berlin. So I bring my own kind of knowledge, and he brings to the table his deep knowledge of philosophy of art, psychology of art, and so on. So basically what we're trying to do in this book is we're looking at AI, aesthetics, and art, but differently, right? Everybody wants to talk about AI creativity. Can AI be creative? Okay, well, it's an interesting question, but let's look at something else, right? Basically what we're looking at is the idea of art as a kind of view, as aesthetic subject, right? Where AI evaluates the aesthetics of music, art, literature, right? The way it happens, and then basically like something that doesn't like it, right? That's how recommendation systems work, right? in a way, when you think about recommendation systems, which are everywhere, the AI is simulating a human aesthetic subject, right? Not the human cognitive subject. And we're using research and ideas from philosophy of art, from Kant onward, and from psychology of art, and bringing it together with AI, and kind of talking about the complexity of human aesthetic response, the complexity of human perception. And people have been studying it. So with Kant, we go back to 18th century. Psychology of art begins in kind of 1870s, right? So much longer tradition. And then show how we get various ideas from the disciplines which create interesting challenges and perhaps future directions for people working at the intersection of art, creativity, and AI should think about, right? So in a way, it's a continuation of my AI aesthetics in some sense, but going much, much deeper.
So if you want, you can come back to present it when it's finished the next time.
Well, the thing is, we're trying to decide, right, if we want to give it to traditional press, which will probably maybe takes a year to publish, or we can maybe give it to some museum, which maybe take a few months, or the moment book is finished, I open my Apple Pages, I make design because I'm a designer, and I put online immediately when everybody can read it, and we can change it. And I'm very, very tempted to do the last thing precisely because I want this book to be part of dialogue. The price, of course, we'll have to pay is with academics. I'm not going to review it because not published by academic press. But I think we're going to be perhaps brave enough, and my feeling is we're going to definitely make it available as PDF for free in some ways online. So basically, the book will be finished by the end of February because when we both start teaching, so we have to finish it. And my birthday is March 31st, and maybe we'll try to put it out around this time. So definitely in the first part of this year. And I'm working, as I said, in 5 or 6 other projects, very different. One is going to be like reflections about 20th century painting. We'll focus on completely unknown Russian artists. So in a way, it's kind of doing what cultural analytics is supposed to do, but doing it by hand, because I can't wait for this work to be digitized. I'm also writing a book about minimalism, aesthetics, Asia. I'm writing a small book called Design Society, right? History of Design Wave. And I'm also developing a project, which is how to extend cultural analytics, how to use it as a predictive tools to quantitatively predict culture in 2030, 40, and 50. And perhaps the last thing is what's going to preoccupy me for the next 15 years. So cultural analytics, which deals with present and the past, cultural analytics 2, which basically does something which nobody really does today, is not to talk about drones and AI, it's all boring stuff, but what kind of things people are going to be reading in 2050, what kind of things we'll have in the museums, will professional artists exist, but trying to do it very theoretically, using sociology of culture, kind of what happens to emerging categories, right? So, doing maybe creating a new type of humanities, kind of future, humanities future studies, or something like this. I don't have a good name yet. I'm looking for a name. I need like some cool name. So, future analytics, maybe something like this. Yeah. So. That's how things are. While I'm working with 6 books, I'm trying to work much less and actually read fiction, etc., etc. So I'm actually trying to work less. So we'll see how. I have no idea how it's going to work out. And I also promised myself not to do any talks this year, but of course, when Monty invited me, I had to agree because I'm a servant to semiotics. But somehow it will work out.
You are a volcano, of course. You are a volcano. Gabriele, you were saying something?
No, I was just addressing that actually the latest article, the latest paper that you can find on manovich.net is about this idea of developing cultural analytics in a futurologistic way. And it's about how we can conceive and predict, relying upon data, what is going to happen in a specific field in 2050. So this is definitely one of his latest interest in the development.
So far it was just a class I taught in the fall in the high school economics, which is in the top university in Russia. So I had best students in my life. Imagine having 50 top 20-year-old intellectuals in your class, and we would talk for like 6 hours non-stop. But I think I will try to write the next 2 months. I will actually write articles so people can read it. Right now, it's just kind of bits and pieces in my head in the syllabus. And I think I would love to teach this classes, workshop in different universities, and then kind of collect wisdom from different students. And then actually I would like to make it a collective project where eventually it has contributions from hundreds of people. Because why should we only want to predict it, right? It makes no sense. So everybody can play a role. So maybe I need to figure out a platform where other people can also upload their predictions or like why we think this will happen, the prediction markets for culture. Yeah, like what are we going to wear in 2025, right? And how do you go? I mean, things doesn't matter, but how do you go about talking about this question? That's what's interesting.
Yes, definitely.
And how talking about this question can change perhaps how we look at fashion history. Like that's what's interesting. Yeah.
I see there is
I've been really passionate about it, but it's a new thing. It's like it's just a few months old, so I'm very excited about it. Yeah.
I see there is another question. Maybe we can use it as the last question of this event by Nick, who asked something about the different variations and structure, and if there is a difference in your new perspective of cultural analytics.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, well, it's a great idea. So I think variations, right, is very important. When you think about the beginning of kind of modern scientific world, which is 19th century, you have Darwin on the one hand, and then biology was actually one of the motivations for development of modern statistics, right? It really studied variation, right? So how come we have 100 million species of living beings on this planet? And then also variation is how evolution, right, happens, right? There are errors in DNA code, there are variations, and some variations have it. Right? Okay, I don't want to go on because I'll make mistakes, right? So it's very, I think, logical for me, right, to look basically at the world culture, history of culture as endless variations. But in the case of Darwin and contemporary evolutionary biology, right, we basically have this sequences of DNAs, right? Recently, we said we found a fish that has 14 sequences of DNA. So, and then there is a variation, right? Changes in the DNA sequences. So the code can be very, very complex. So this is way more complex than how we think about variation structure in humanities, where we say, okay, there's a particular plot, and then there are different fairy tales which are versions of this plot, right? So again, thinking about Victor Prop, 28 functions, or Grimace, right? Or, like, okay, Hero 1,000 Faces, right? So the way we approach variations in humanities is in a much more simplified way, which I think doesn't give justice to the actual complexity and variability of human culture, right? So it makes sense for me to use statistical and our data science tool simply to capture this variability in a more nuanced way, right? So what I want to do is I don't want to start with assumption. Okay, we have 30 types of narratives. So we have 2 types of narratives. We have 5 types of portraits, even variations. No, I want to start bottom up and say, okay, let's measure, right, millions and billions of artifacts. And then it's kind of up to us how to organize these measurements, right? If we want, we can say, okay, maybe we found that there are 5 types and everything is different. Everything is variation of 5 types. But if we want, we can say we can probably find 500 types, right? So, and the ultimate goal of this exercise is to simply allow us to think about culture in a more fluid, more complex, and more realistic way, right? So basically have a better maps. So that's, I think, the difference, right? Because humanities have been using kind of language, and language itself is categorical, and we didn't have kind of data management tools until recently. But of course, you have individual researchers who spend their whole lifetimes analyzing things, and these are historians or literary historians who basically have supercomputers in their head. And then they say, okay, this is the structure of folktale, this is the structure of narrative, this is the structure of myth, structure of fashion. But I think ultimately, with human systems, we limited a small number of structures and variations, so small number of elements. And I think if we're dealing with larger scale data with millions and billions of artifacts, we don't have to start with any preconceived idea if there are 5 types or 10 types. And obviously, in some cases, it may be folktale or ancient myth. Yeah, maybe there's 5 or 25 structures and variations. Maybe in contemporary Instagram, there's 5 structures, maybe there's 5 million structures. I have no idea, right? But what I would say is, I think that this idea of small number of structures and variations, it's more appropriate to talk about historical cultures, because historical cultures, in fact, were kind of much more fixed, right? Much more less fluid. But I think once we enter 20th century and invention of a new becomes the norm, right? When I think about 20th century painting, right, it's meaningless, right, to reduce it to like 5 types or 25 types, 100 types. And in fact, we don't have any language to talk about, right? We don't have any language to talk about something which is neither full realism or geometric abstraction, right? So computers can give us with language, right? The same can be said for poetry, the same can be said for blog posts, and so on and so forth. So I think, I mean, it's not the only way to talk about it, it's just one way, but I think the idea is to ultimately represent variability of human culture more precisely, and give us different ways to think about this variability. And ultimately, ultimate impossible task is to completely get rid of the idea of structure, right? Not think about culture. So here we have prototype of a watch, a prototype, and when we have different types of watches, yeah, it's true for watches, right? And I'm looking at the prototype of a laptop, which has keyboard and a screen. But I think if we look at painting, or if we look at theater, if we look, I don't know, at maybe it doesn't work, right? So we can think of culture only as endless differences, right? Without postulating this high level of abstraction. That's, I think, the ultimate challenge, and that's why the last section of the book is called How to Think About Categories. And perhaps the computer, as this alien consciousness, we have to learn from computers how to think differently and how to get rid of categories, which of course is impossible, and that's why it's so fascinating to ask this question.
Lev, we already talked for just a bit more than 1 hour. We could talk, I think, for the 24 hours you were mentioning before about all these issues and topics, because I really was intrigued by the book, because it's like a map of things we need to think about. Maybe we cannot agree on some very details, but we have to face these issues. And so it's really it's a book that anybody involved in social research and humanities needs to at least address and read in order to understand which are these issues and topics. I wouldn't like to steal more time from you now, so if there are no questions, I would say thanks a lot for giving us your time and for talking in such a rich and passionate way with us about cultural analytics, but about your perspective in general, and about your work with the lab. We had a lot of fun, and it was really stimulating to have the chance to directly interact, not only on Facebook, with you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I have to say that one of the things I'm planning to do this year is, people invite me, like you guys, and you're very nice, right? But maybe not everybody can join at this time. So I want myself, right, like just Zoom, it's Facebook, stream, YouTube. I want to do a series of like lectures and questions answer series around the book, and I want to schedule them at different times so people in Asia can join and people in Europe can join and so on. I was going to do it, but then I got so tired after fall semester. I basically couldn't do anything for like 2 weeks. You know how it is. Now I'm getting energy, and I have like a brand new Fuji camera, and I have lights at home and microphone, so it's going to be like it's a blogger, right? So I think I'm going to announce it pretty soon, and I will schedule it. Maybe we'll see. I start to 1. If I like, maybe I do every month, right? I love dialogue, right? I love dialogue. One of the great sorrows of my life is I spent 40 years living in America, where social life and friendship is not valued very much, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we did a few years ago, we did questionnaire. We asked like people in Russia and America, okay, like here's 20 things put them in order of importance. So in Russia, it was like something like family, job, family, career, friends. In America, friends were number 20, right? So one of the reasons, right, I'm always online, I'm always on Facebook, I'm always traveling to Europe, etc., is I'm a kind of animal which can only exist in dialogue, right? If I can talk to people, I'll just disappear, right? And now I'm actually living in Korea because of coronavirus. Actually having, like, after a few months in Korea, I have more friends here than I ever had, like, in American years. You know? I mean, Americans, we work very hard, but maybe that's why we don't have time to socialize as much, right? Anyway, sorry, it's a bit, but I want to say that, I simply want to say that, you know, so Lev, what is your mega method? What is your meta method? Conversation. So I want to close on this note, and I want to say to people who need to hear this in the audience, don't be afraid that somebody will steal your ideas. If you have good ideas, people steal them anyway. It's an honor, right? Don't spend 10 years working on your little thing and publishing an obscure journal. I'm the only academic who made a whole career by publishing everything online since 1993. I almost never send any papers to peer-reviewed journals. It worked very well, right? I think that, you know, Bakhtin, right, was one of many thinkers who emphasized the value of dialogue. You know, you can say humans are makers of tools, according to Marx. Humans are makers of art, but humans are basically communication animals. So thank you for having this opportunity.
Thank
and,
you.
you know, raising like the virtual, I don't know, glass to more dialogues. And perhaps, you know, one thing which we need to do is to invent new media. Right? I mean, we have these amazing computers and we have Facebook, but we're simply limiting. We are talking about people listening, writing questions. It feels like we're like in 18th century, right? So maybe, you know, so I hope that, you know, designers, programmers, semioticians would invent completely new methods for communicating, where millions of us can be talking at the same time. We can hear every person. It would be amazing. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
You are delicious, and we hope to have as soon as possible another occasion to dialogue with you, because it's really, as I said, stimulating for both of us. And also, I think all the audience is happy for this occasion. So thank you. Have a good stay in Korea, in Seoul. And let's hope to see you also in real life, and not only
yeah.
But
you know, there are so many people I know who kind of want to talk to me in Milan. I think the moment, I mean, I was in Milan last year, but just very, very shortly.
Okay.
And, you know, I have so many, I think, connections. So I think the moment becomes possible. So as soon as it becomes possible to travel, probably Milan will be one of my first stops. So we'll see you soon, guys. Stay in touch.
Thank you. See you in
Milan.
Ciao.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Okay. Thank you for all the audience. We hope you enjoyed this occasion. I keep on speaking with my broken English because next week we have another English speaker guest, who is Gabriele.
On February the 4th, we are going to host Henry Jenkins.
So we hope to see you there too. It was a great honor to have Lev Manovich.
And it was super fun.
Yeah, it's very fun, but we could expect it because we knew his work. So we are very happy, and have a good time, have a good night, Lev, and have a good afternoon, Italian audience. Bye bye.
Ciao.